And it's really strange that at this moment in history, the drumbeat for war is going on for the United States, not just in one part of the world, but in two different parts of the world at the same time. And it's kind of happening under the radar, to mix my metaphors a little bit, because the media isn't really covering it that much. And to add strangeness upon strangeness, some of the what I consider to be acts of war are taking place just a short distance from where I'm speaking right now here in Washington, D.C. So here to catch us up on that and whatever else comes to mind in our conversation is our friend Max Blumenthal. You know Max's work. He is a journalist. He is an author. His latest book is The Management of Savagery, about the Islamophobia industry and its effect on us and the world. And he is also co-founder of the Gray Zone Project, which has been doing a lot of reporting in these areas. So first of all, Max, thanks for coming back on the program.
Good to be back as always.
Secondly, why do you look a little tired?
Yeah, I'm a little bit frazzled and worn out because one of our writers and a close colleague, Alex Rubinstein, one of our writers, Anya Parampil, are both in the Venezuelan embassy right now and have essentially been under siege with about 20 other activists who entered several weeks ago, but really battened down the hatches the night of the coup in Venezuela. And they have branded themselves the Embassy Protection Collective and have been surrounded by these right-wing mobs that are directed by the forces of the self-appointed coup president Juan Guaido and have been sanctioned by the State Department, which is, controls the Secret Service and has been sending orders to the Secret Service, who are supposed to be in charge of the embassy, and are working with these extremely violent right-wing mobs to lay siege to the embassy in hopes of flushing them out and then turning it into a lobbying shop for the Venezuelan opposition to continue a coup which has destabilized Venezuela and is ruining its economy, which the State Department has boasted about. So, if any of my colleagues or writers were in there, it would be a really stressful situation, and that's what we're facing. At the same time, it's a really inspiring situation. This is an action unlike anything I've witnessed in my lifetime. I went through Occupy. I participated and covered a lot of the Black Lives Matter protests, especially around New York City where I lived at the time. But this is such an interesting action because what it's done is it's effectively obstructed a major foreign policy objective of one of the most extreme militaristic wings of the foreign policy establishment in D.C., as represented by John Bolton and Mike Pompeo. And it's also exposed the real face of the Venezuelan opposition for all Americans to see as racist, homophobic, violent, a collection of middle and upper class sociopaths. And this is a distillation of what passes for their ideology, what their politics truly are, and what they will bring into force if they come into power in Venezuela, which would essentially be a civil war. So I think no one expected this to happen. No one expected the journalists inside to be performing at such a high level as they have been. And certainly the Venezuelan opposition, which is just brimming with entitlement, did not expect that they couldn't just march into an embassy that doesn't belong to them in total violation of the Vienna Conventions. And here come some American citizens to uphold international law as well as DC law around evictions. And last night was one of the more troubling nights. The other really troubling night was when these right-wing hooligans actually tried to physically break in while the Secret Service stood by. And who knows what they would have done if they had gotten inside. Last night, the electricity was cut. The local electricity company, Pepco, violated DC law, apparently under orders from the State Department, and cut electricity to flush these activists out.
And I want to put all of this in context for anybody who might not be clear about what's going on. First of all, the coup attempt, which struck me as reading about it, at least what went on in Venezuela, as almost half-hearted, as if the coup plotters assumed that other people would do the hard work for them, that the U.S. would step in, that the military, some faction of the military might step in. So it was really, it seemed to me not to condone successful coups of this kind, but it seemed to me kind of like the coup plotters that couldn't shoot straight. There seemed to, I don't know if that's fair, but there seemed to be kind of like an aura of incompetence as well as venality around what they were trying to do. Is it, first of all, is that accurate?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can give more background if you want, but that's pretty accurate. And
Yeah, and
that's actually what Juan Guaido, the U.S. appointed coup leader, is openly saying right now, is that, we didn't have enough support from who, Uncle Sam.
Right. So he's that stage, and there are certain life cycle. If you follow this country's attempt to interfere in the politics of other countries, there is a certain life cycle in unsuccessful attempts, and the blame the U.S. for not doing it for us is part of that cycle often at this point in the process. But just in terms of setting the broad picture to begin with, okay, so there was this coup attempt. Basically, you have Juan Guaido in Venezuela, 35 years old, president, I believe, of his party in the National Assembly. That's correct, right? And there is no, despite what a lot of people have heard in this country, there's no evidence that the last Venezuelan election was in fact stolen. Whatever you think of socialism or the current leadership of the country, the fact is people have certified this as a legitimate election. And at any point, stop me if you want to disagree or add more or whatever. But so you have now a situation, but the U.S. has made it very clear that it wants to overthrow the government of Venezuela and replace it with its handpicked successor, and who it chose as Juan Guaido. And his kind of is well-to-do. He represents the kind of well-to-do class in Venezuela, and they've stepped in and they've acted violently and thuggishly in Venezuela, in the United States now as well. And one of the things that amazes me most about it is that it seems to me that the United States government must be violating all sorts of international laws, because you have, I mean, I suppose they could go to international court and try to challenge the legitimacy of the Venezuelan government if they felt that there was compelling evidence to do so. Instead, they are trying by force, as I understand it, to install their faction in the Venezuelan embassy, and they are using other means of force, including cutting off the power, which is when you have a country's embassy in your own nation, in this case, the United States, that embassy is considered their sovereign territory. I mean, again, stop me if I'm wrong, but this is what I've been trying to get through my head this whole time, is that's the sovereign territory of the current government of Venezuela that's being treated aggressively by this cutoff of power. And water too, did you say, or just power?
Well, that could be next.
Yeah, and sorry, I don't want to give them any ideas, but and then
The oxygen,
right,
bringing
right.
the Montgomery Burns sun blocker.
And then you have their own, the Guaido faction's own people brutalizing people in the street outside. So it seems to me that the fundamental obligation of a host country is not only not being met, but is being flagrantly violated. So that's me. I'm sorry I took so long, but that's me setting the context for anyone that might not know. Is that more or less correct?
Absolutely. I mean, well done. I mean, just on the political side right now, the coup that many people watching this would be aware of, if you've been following any media, that took place on April 30th was really the final blow to Juan Guaido's project, the project of Juan Guaido. And I would agree, I don't agree with his domestic views, but I would agree with Ron Paul on this, that Juan Guaido is worth a lot more to the CIA right now dead than he is alive. I would hate to be that guy.
Why? Now tell me about that.
If you listen to Mike Pence 2 days ago at this Rockefeller-founded oil and arms industry front, the Council on the Americas, at his big speech on Venezuela in D.C., he declared the security of Juan Guaido will be protected, and it is important to us. And when he says that, it's code for he's bait on our pole and we want you to bite it. Because if Juan Guaido is killed and the killing can be blamed on the Venezuelan government, that's the perfect pretext for some kind of escalation that could justify military intervention. But the U.S. hasn't been able to find the pretext yet. They tried on February 23rd with this fake humanitarian arms shipment where, as we helped expose at the Gray Zone, opposition hooligans on the Santander Bridge from Colombia to Venezuela actually burned the U.S. aid with Molotov cocktails. They burned their own aid, then blamed it on the Maduro government, and we exposed that. And they just don't have a pretext to escalate. They don't have, the chemical attack, the red line on the chemical attack. They don't have, the Maidan snipers, that kind of thing. And so Guaido's killing would be that. But beyond that, as a living man riding around the country on a motorcycle at this point, he blew his load on the coup. It's over. He's worthless. And his mentor, Leopoldo Lopez, who's the real commander of the opposition, at least the U.S.-backed wing of the opposition, which has been cultivated by the U.S. for over a decade, through all these training sessions to never negotiate with the government, avoid dialogue, and just continue this project of destabilization, which has received tens and tens of millions of dollars from U.S. soft power organizations. Lopez is now hiding in the Spanish embassy. He was under house arrest, and he came out to try to mobilize this military coup. They'd actually been tricked by members of Maduro's inner circle, specifically the defense minister, Vladimir Padrino, who had given them the indication that he was going to flip, and they thought that was the card they needed to flip. And then Padrino comes out on national TV and says, "I stand with Maduro and we'll fight with our blood." Whoops, Lopez is seen with Guaido near this military base they'd failed to take in eastern Caracas, the affluent area, with no people around them, and they're kind of standing there like, what did we just do? And so that failed. And now you have this crisis within the Trump administration, where Trump had been joking in the past that Bolton was trying to get him into 5 wars. John Bolton, his national security advisor, who was basically installed because the Mercers, Trump's big benefactor, had put so much money behind his Secure America PAC, and probably because Trump was watching him on Fox News during executive time and said, I like this guy. But now Trump is openly saying he's trying to get me into a war in Venezuela that I have no interest in. Many people around Trump, including people in the Pentagon, around the Joint Chiefs, the people who actually have experienced war, are really uncomfortable about what Bolton's trying to do. Bolton has exposed the names of people that the U.S. has tried to flip and burned those as kind of possible connections for the CIA and other elements in the State Department. He's just run a really reckless foreign policy. So the rifts in Trump's foreign policy team are fully exposed. And then you have the embassy situation, which, U.S. media isn't paying enough attention to.
Right. And I want
with good reason.
Okay, well, I want to get to that. And just to close the loop on the big picture, and again, we're talking with journalist and author Max Blumenthal about what's going on in Venezuela. John, the one thing about Donald Trump that seemed like it might be a little different when he was running for president, for all the abhorrent things he was espousing and his behavior and corruption, all the horrible things about Donald Trump, he was the one candidate from either party who appeared, other than Bernie Sanders, but who appeared to be willing to consider distancing himself from the sort of bipartisan aggressive national security policy of the last 50 years. Well, that didn't last, and you're saying it's the Mercers that put them in. Instead, John Bolton, who first came to public attention during the Bush v. Gore case. I'm here from the Bush campaign and I'm from the George W. Bush campaign, and I'm here to stop the counting,
Right.
is what he said when they were counting votes. So burst on the national scene as a anti-democratic figure, as a figure who was opposed to voting as a principle, or the counting of votes, and then was a notoriously aggressive figure, even by our national security establishment standards, but it takes care of its own, and he's one of its own. So the Mercers force him on Trump, but now Trump is backing away from this whole war thing because it doesn't sound as easy as maybe Bolton made it sound it would be.
Yeah.
And by the way, Venezuela, geographically, it's a big country. It's a diverse country. It has mountains. It has plains. It has jungle.
It actually has a good military. And what the Russians have been doing there, all 100 of them, is basically making sure that Venezuela's military knows how to use anti-aircraft batteries. And you can see that Syria's military has made good use of Soviet-era anti-aircraft batteries and used them as a fairly effective deterrent against the Israeli Air Force, which is equipped with the best U.S. jets, and as a deterrent against the U.S. itself. So that's what's going on. And, if Donald Trump had just been, he's just really too febrile and lazy to really understand that he has been victimized not only by an intelligence failure, but by an intelligence scam until afterwards. But if he had been reading The Gray Zone when we were in Venezuela, he would have understood clearly that this coup could not have possibly succeeded. And it's not just because of the military deterrence capacity of Venezuela's government, but also because of the popular support that Maduro still maintains and the lack of it for Juan Guaido. Guaido has his built-in base. I'm not denying that he does have a base. And as you mentioned up top, it's the middle and upper classes who tend to be lighter skinned. You have this legacy of colonialism. And then, there are people who are disenchanted with the government because the economic situation is not very good at all. And U.S. sanctions are making sure that there's hyperinflation instead of just inflation, and that people are immiserated. And Guaido had hoped that those people would join him on his little moped ride around the country. They're really not. And Maduro's been able to maintain the streets. So it's just that the U.S. consistently undermines the countries that it targets with regime change, and the media reinforces it with this rhetoric of the people versus the dictator, whether it's Libya, Syria, even North Korea, or Nicaragua, which I reported on last year. They don't understand that there is a level of consent for the leaders of these countries, even if they're not elected in a liberal democratic system like the leaders of one of our two corporate-run parties are in this country.
Well, and that gets us to, and I mentioned this sort of bipartisan consensus on military action in this country, which is huge, and seems now maybe it's starting to fracture. We'll wait and see, but certainly not in the Trump era. Now we have this embassy situation. In the context of all this, okay, we have this continuing effort to instigate a coup or a civil war, even if one side has very little popular support. And I know the Gray Zone Project published polling results from Venezuela showing that there was enormous support for even those who did not support Maduro did not want military intervention from the U.S. But
I can confirm that with my own personal interactions with them.
That's right. We talked after you came back from Venezuela. So we now have a situation where we have this ongoing attempt to foment trouble. And I think the embassy situation, if I read it correctly, but tell me, here in Washington, D.C., is that the Guaido forces and their helpers in the U.S. government wanted them to seize the embassy and install their designated Venezuelan ambassador. By the way, must also be a violation of international law.
Yes.
But their handpicked Venezuelan ambassador so that that person could then make proclamations from the Venezuelan embassy as if they were the legitimate representative
Right.
of the Venezuelan people. And there's only one target for an action like that, Max Blumenthal, that I can think of, and that's the American people. That's to convince the American people that this action, this military action that the government wants to take, actually has support and will succeed. So it seems to me, in a very real sense, that the violence and aggression taking place at the Venezuelan embassy, it's directed against the protesters, it's directed against the press, it's directed against officials of the government of the Venezuela, of the government, of the officials of the government of Venezuela. Good thing I'm not a professional broadcaster. And but that the real target is the American voter.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And it will be a component of the Trump campaign. If you watched his rally in February, where Trump was in Miami before the Venezuelan exile community in Florida, or at least the right-wing MAGA hat wearing segment of it, where he was trying to point to Venezuela as how socialism will go wrong when Bernie Sanders comes to power in the U.S. So the Venezuelan embassy under opposition control would be essentially a wing of the Trump campaign in 2020, as well as a lobbying shop, and they would usurp all of the money stolen by the U.S. through Citgo to fund the whole operation. And so that's what it's about. It's about convincing the American public, too, that the real Venezuelan government is seated in Washington, not Caracas, and to continue the coup endlessly, even though there's nowhere I can see it going except into a deeper phase of hybrid warfare that would possibly mean a dirty war. And so you have these activists who have been given the keys by the legitimate Venezuelan government, which controls institutions, and what they're doing there is not an occupation. They're actually doing something. They're doing two things that are consistent with international law. First of all, they're defending the Vienna Conventions, specifically Article 22, which mandates that embassies be maintained and not interfered with, even if the country that holds the embassy is at war with the host country. And the second thing they're doing is they're functioning as a custodian due to this conflict, because the U.S. has thrown out the Venezuelan personnel, and there are negotiations behind the scenes right now between the Venezuelan government and another country to take custody of that embassy and that would allow these activists to leave and the embassy to continue functioning and to provide consular support to Venezuelans. If Carlos Vecchio, the fake coup ambassador, who's basically this sort of CIA national security state project, comes in there, he will not be able to provide consular support because his little faux administration controls no institutions in Venezuela. They can barely even control their own Twitter accounts. And so it's actually a defense of international law that and a resistance against the law of the jungle that John Bolton wants to impose that these activists are providing right now. And I actually have heard that the negotiations for that handover of the embassy are going very well and could be completed any day. We could actually see a really positive resolution to this, thanks to the sacrifice that these activists are making now without electricity. And in Caracas, you have a situation where the U.S. has already negotiated with Switzerland, which is supposed to be this neutral country, even though they recognize Guaido, to take over the U.S. embassy. And that would mean that the U.S. wouldn't lose its embassy in Caracas. Now, if the U.S. were to lose its embassy, the Venezuelan government, if they take this embassy and give it over to this clown show, Carlos Vecchio and his thugs, the U.S. embassy could be turned into, I don't know, a community center or something. And they would never be able to get it back because they would fear that listening devices had been planted everywhere. There's no way you can remove it. So you have to rebuild another embassy, which would cost like $100 million. So this issue of reciprocity, along with the negotiations, has actually dealt the Embassy Protection Collective, which has been sanctioned by the legitimate sovereign government of Venezuela, a very strong hand here. And I think what we're witnessing is possibly on the horizon, is a major, major defeat to the Trump foreign policy, while this disagreement and crisis and rancor, this war of the Mandarins takes place within the White House.
So, where is the Venezuelan ambassador to the U.S. and her or his staff right now? They are not in the embassy. Are they out of the country? Were they expelled? Are they somewhere else in the U.S.? Or?
In 2017, expulsions began of the Venezuelan diplomatic staff, and they were sent back to Caracas. And the last expulsions took place, I believe, as soon as Guaido was recognized either in January, and the final diplomat was, I think, left towards the end of April as the ultimate coup approached. So they're back in Venezuela. The foreign minister of Venezuela, Jorge Ariasa, has been sanctioned by the U.S. for no reason whatsoever except that the U.S. wants regime change. And so he's not allowed to travel outside 25 miles of New York City or from 25 miles from the UN, as far as I know. And then Samuel Moncada is the UN ambassador for Venezuela. He's still in New York. But the U.S. is just sanctioning everyone down to Maduro's dog just to achieve this goal, which has never been achieved before with sanctions. And not to switch subjects completely to Iran, but if you look at the new sanctions imposed on Iran, it's on the metal industry, the aluminum industry. That's where a lot of the jobs are for Iranian workers. It has nothing to do with the government. And so you see how the sanctions are being applied under Trump with consent from a wing of the Democratic foreign policy establishment to collectively punish the population, which is a violation of the Geneva Conventions. And I want to mention one more thing before we get to the segue to anything else, which is that, as I mentioned, there are two journalists inside the embassy, Anya Parampil and Alex Rubinstein, and they've been threatened by name consistently from outside. When Anya tried to question Carlos Vecchio before she entered the embassy, she was physically assaulted by his mob. And we have journalists on the outside who are covering it. And those who are seen as not being with the opposition, like Alina Duarte, who is a Mexican journalist working for Telesur, have not only been physically attacked and threatened, she has actually gone home to find that her locks have been tampered with and that someone attempted to enter her home. There's an opposition Facebook page which has falsely identified her as a Cuban agent. And I myself have been, when I show up, followed. People say, I know who you are, we're watching you, and hectored, that kind of thing, which is fine for me. I wouldn't have made that complaint. But the other journalists are being threatened in a way that if the Beltway press corps, which is always whining about Trump being mean, experienced, every one of these press freedom advocacy organizations would be howling to the moon, but we've heard nothing from the Committee to Protect Journalists. We've heard nothing from Human Rights Watch. And that's because these organizations are so consistently accustomed to being on board with the USAID agenda for the world, which is soft power and regime change, and using journalists essentially as a human shield for the projection of American power, that they can't bring themselves to defend actual journalists doing their job against the pawns of American empire.
Well, I think that's a very important point, and I'm glad you made it. And again, we're speaking with journalist and author Max Blumenthal. So before we go, then I just want to make sure that we do touch on Iran as well. Because, and you mentioned Iran briefly, we're applying sanctions against Iran. I think it's time that people realize that sanctions never hurt the leadership of a country, that they are always directed to a greater or lesser extent against the population of a country, and that they are in fact an act of aggression. They're an act of war. They're not a peaceful response to a diplomatic standoff. So now we're hearing more and more, just in the last couple of weeks, and I'll remind our listeners that you and I are talking on Thursday, that we're recording on Thursday, but we're hearing more and more bellicose talk about Iran. Iran is a reasonably wealthy nation. It is a large nation. We're not talking about going to war with Grenada if we go to war with Iran. What is going on there? I mean, are we, this is why I mentioned in the introduction that we might find ourselves at the precipice of two wars being started simultaneously. Are we looking at John Bolton and others actually preparing for military action against Iran?
Javad Zarif, who is Iran's foreign minister, was recently in Washington and New York, and he made one point consistently in every talk he gave, which is that Trump's foreign policy has been completely overtaken by the B team, and he referred to the four Bs: Bolton, Bibi, Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel, bin Zayed, the Crown Prince of the United Arab Emirates, and bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. And these four figures who would be deeply unpopular among any progressive and among most Americans, and who are mostly unknown and are all unelected to by Americans, are in charge of Trump's policy on Iran. And it's a war policy. And the way that they're trying to generate a war is to force Iran to escalate and then to point the finger and say, well, we have to go in. And there is no doubt, it's beyond debate, that any military conflict with Iran would be 10 times as disastrous as the conflict in Iraq. You're facing a society that is completely mobilized, that is coherent, that has an ancient culture far more rich than ours and more cohesive, and a military that, while it's funded at about 1/100th or 1,000th the level of the U.S. military, is very effective and expansive as well. And so what they're trying to do by applying sanctions that affect the population is to produce an internal explosion. It's a model of the kind of pressure cooker policy the U.S. applied under George Kennan's stewardship against the Soviet Union, and it is not going to work. Iran is a revolutionary society. A mass of the population will actually stand more closely with the leadership when sanctions are applied that harshly. And so you actually have the U.S. moving into a mode of actually just trying to force Iran to escalate by, for example, closing off the Strait of Hormuz, which I think 30% of the world's oil supply goes through. And that would mean pretext to something. And again, you have these insane figures driving this policy. You also have the Iran.
And by the way, closing the Strait of Hormuz would also immediately cause a massive global economic shock.
Definitely. It would cause oil prices to skyrocket and everything else that comes with it.
Right.
And it's important to note, by the way, that the U.S. has strategically kept oil prices low since about 2015 in order to harm the economies of Venezuela and Russia and Iran. And how does it do that? It does it by Saudi Arabia opening up the taps because it has the largest strategic reserves. It can put the most oil on the market. Aramco can't be touched by anyone else. So oil's being used kind of as a weapon here. So Trump has gotten out of the Iran deal. That leaves the sort of P5, the Europeans, to abide by it. But then the Trump administration is applying secondary sanctions, which is a message to the Europeans and European companies that if you continue to do business with Iran, we will sanction you, which has never been done before, to my knowledge. You basically have the U.S. threatening countries with sanctions for abiding by a deal that was agreed on by the UN General Security Council. I mean, think that is unprecedented and insane.
And the countries that it's threatening, most of them are, or many of them are also fellow members of NATO. Meaning that there's a mutual defense pact with the countries that are now being threatened with sanctions, which is a weapon of war.
Right. And so Europe is forced to choose between doing business with the U.S., with the world's largest GDP, or little Iran. And so it naturally chooses the U.S., but there's friction. And this is a chance for Europe to demonstrate some kind of backbone, some kind of principle. But Iran has given them a deadline and said, you've got 60 days, or I think 30 days, to decide if you want to honor the Iran deal, which you agreed on. We made a solemn oath at the UN General Security Council, or if you want to go with the law of the jungle of the 4Bs. And then we'll see what happens. But Iran is actually putting its cards on the table, and it can deter the U.S. in many ways. I mean, one thing I would point to is the $1 billion U.S. embassy in Baghdad. That could go up in smoke pretty quickly if the U.S. wanted to escalate militarily. What it's really going to take right now is more attention from the U.S. media to the danger of this situation as the USS Lincoln and an aircraft carrier group steam towards the Persian Gulf. We have to recognize this is not routine. We have to recognize the complete perversion of diplomatic norms, which have already been perverted under the Obama administration. But there needs to be a sense of outrage and an outcry in Washington over this in Venezuela. And right now there really isn't. You don't see the editorial boards even discussing this, because this should be put at the top of the agenda in the presidential campaign. I do think that if you have Biden as president, you will have no Iran deal. And I think there's a wing of the I know there's a wing of the Democratic Party establishment, the Center for a New American Security, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, part of the Chuck Schumer wing, that wants to actually seize the opportunity of Trump getting out of the Iran deal to continue to put the squeeze on Iran. And there's been like an editorial in Bloomberg urging them to do so. And then you have the Bernie Sanders wing, and the people around Bernie who I know who actually would like to get back in the Iran deal. So it really highlights the urgency of the clash within the Democratic primary. It's about war and peace. It's not just about having with these super important life and death issues in the U.S. about Medicare and health care and free college. It's also about whether we go to a war that will be more catastrophic, 10 times more catastrophic possibly than Iraq.
Well, in my ideal world, we would have a media that reported a lot on these international events, including ones none are more important or consequential than war and peace, and we would have a progressive movement in this country that cared a lot more about matters of war and peace too. But we're working on both those things. So unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. But Max Blumenthal, your new book is The Management of Savagery. I encourage people to read it. Thanks for a really comprehensive update on all this stuff.
Thanks for having me, and viewers can check out thegrayzone.com and as well as Mint Press News to keep up on what's going on at the embassy, assuming it's still taking place by the time this comes out. So thanks again.
Good. Thank you.